Chelsea, Real Madrid, Paris Saint-Germain, the Yomiuri Giants, Western Province. What do all these teams have in common? They are dominant, nationwide sporting powerhouses from their country's capital. So who does Australia have to represent their capital in their flagship sport? Oh. Yeah, despite having teams in the NRL, Super Rugby and the A-League, the W League, how did MacArthur get a team before Canberra? Jesus. Well, despite being represented in multiple major Australian codes, Canberra still doesn't have a standalone AFL team. Today, I'm reporting from Canberra's Central Business District as we explore the history of the sport in the land of the Pollies, and with the discussion for a 20th AFL team looming large, whether Canberra deserves to get it. This is GAZ-man on location.
Right as the ACT was being founded in 1911, the first game of football was being played between the Royal Military College and the Home Affairs Department. And although the teams and the date of the match were recorded for posterity, the actual location of it, not quite so much. The official sources at the time listed it as the park, real helpful, so the closest I could get was the Royal Military College's official oval in Duntroon. This is probably the place where football started here. There's another oval, Alamein Oval, just down the road, but this is the best we can get. Amazingly, the soldiers lost to the bureaucrats by a single point, with the match being called off at three-quarter time due to poor weather. Yeah, that's right. The weather's always been that bad here. As I'm standing here right now, my blood is turning into ice water. A couple more exhibition matches were played here between Federal City and Duntroon before the competition eventually moved to the bigger and probably better Manuka Oval. The first Australian Football League was formed in 1924, with two teams joining the two initial founders, Acton and Queanbeyan, which, and I cannot stress this enough, is in another state. In 1927, the league officially registered as the Canberra Australian National Football League, or CANFL, which at least rolls off the tongue better than FTAFL, their first attempt at a name. Not a whole lot happened, at least not anything that anyone thought to jot down, until the early 1970s, when the ACT-AFL, as it was called at the time, was invited to join the NFL Night Series, a competition hosted by the Australian National Football Council, which involved all the best teams from all the footballing states to join together in one big competition. The fledgling ACT in New South Wales got to field representative statesides rather than sending the fucking Queanbeyan Tigers to get mulched by Hawthorn and Norwood. While New South Wales got beaten by a side named after Paul Rudd's little animal friends, the ACT did quite well for themselves, surprising VFA side Caulfield in the first round. This led them to a date against... Norwood. Right. Well, they got beat, but considering how small football was in the ACT at the time and how big Norwood was in SA, the little guys did quite well in the end. After all, Norwood ended up winning the whole competition that year. The following year, they ground out a narrow loss to VFA side Sandringham in the first round. In 1979, the VFL was getting kind of antsy because they wanted to be the one controlling power to organise major footballing competitions in Australia instead of the body whose literal job it is to organise football tournaments in Australia. So, they made their own national tournament with blackjack, hookers and the representative sides from New South Wales, Queensland and the ACT. The three turncoat states ending up sealing the face of the ANFC when they died in 1996 and helping the rise of the VFL to become the national powerhouse it is today. As the top-seeded representative side in the draw, they got a round 2 entry into the 1979 tournament, with the other representative sides having already lost to average VFL sides. The ACT, they drew North Melbourne. 1970s, North Melbourne. Yeah, didn't end well. What are you going to do? They not only lost that match, but they lost their late entry privileges for the 1980 edition of the tournament when the ANFC-aligned teams decided to crawl back towards the VFL and join their new tournament. And in round 1, guess who the ACT drew? That's right, the Blues, their big, boisterous brother, who they lost to because by that time, with increased interest in the sport in New South Wales, the talent pool had just grown exponentially. It didn't look great for the ACT. In 1981, the two would face off again, but this time, there was more at stake. The ACT-AFL had just submitted oh my god, these birds won't fucking shut up. The ACT-AFL had just submitted a request to enter the VFL, as the hungry Victorian football machine had just tossed aside the VFA's carcass and searched for fresh meat across the border. Meanwhile, VFL clubs Fitzroy, St Kilda and South Melbourne were all conducting feasibility analyses to see if they could benefit from moving to Sydney, while the VFL itself was conducting an exercise to try and establish a brand new team in the Harbourside. A win here might just impress Alan Aylett and get Canberra that sweet, sweet exposure they needed to make their VFL dreams come true. They drew the Blues in round one, and they didn't beat them. Sorry, I misread that. They didn't just beat them, they destroyed them. They beat Tasmania in round two and took the VFL side Footscray all the way to the end in a playoff, just missing out on round three. In terms of what they were expecting to do at that tournament, this was the best possible result that they could have mustered in order to get that VFL seat. And had the VFL gone ahead with their proposed standalone Sydney team, they may well have gotten an invite. Alas, for reasons I'll get into in a further series, South Melbourne were in such a dire financial state they had to take a financial bailout assistance package from the VFL to move to Sydney, keeping the league's number of teams at an even 12. For the moment, Canberra had missed the party bus. They'd been kicked out, their tickets ripped up. Canberra, well, they were told to come back in a decade, and boy were the ACT sporting interests angry about that one. In fact, they were more than angry. They felt betrayed, and most of all, they felt scared, because a new player was about to enter the arena. 1 year later, the ACT-AFL's worst fears were realised. The 1980s equivalent of the NRL capitalised on burgeoning rugby league participation rates and established a team in the capital. The Canberra Raiders were born. They were the second franchise the capital had after the NBL's Canberra Cannons, which had been established only a couple of months prior. But the ACT-AFL still had time. The Raiders completely sucked for the first few years that they were in existence, setting up a pattern that they really rectified today. Topical reference, haha. In 1984, the ACT-AFL knocked at the VFL's door again, and things looked immediately rosy. The VFL had outlined a plan for a 16-team competition, which at that time was planned to have the 12 existing VFL clubs, plus 2 in SA and WA. Never mind the fact that Norwood and Port Adelaide had basically knelt at their feet for admission for the last few years, but yeah, anyway. To try and convince the VFL that they could draw bigger crowds than the Swans, the ACT-AFL tried to convince VFL sides to come here and play at Manuka Oval for the 1984 and 85 seasons. Unfortunately, this came to no avail. Then, in 1985, the death knell. The VFL reneged on its initial plans, now planning on setting up a franchise in sunny Brisbane, once again pissing off to Queensland to chase money, alongside a new WA side, desperate to sell franchises to interested investors so that their millions could be funneled into struggling boutique Victorian clubs. As part of the recruitment zoning shifts, and without the ACT-AFL's knowledge or consent, the ACT area was now a Sydney Swans recruitment zone. Again, the Canberrites were pissed, not only because of the double cross, but because time had finally run out. The Canberra Raiders made their first final series in 1987. They had recruited exciting youngsters and, I can't believe I'm saying this, future politicians in Mal Meninga and Glenn Lazarus, the Brick with Eyes, and now looked to be the team of the future. Hi, I couldn't get to Adelaide in time to film this bit, so I'm just standing in a pocket of Sydney that reminds me of Adelaide's CBD to tell you that Canberra was so desperate to find a footy league that would accept them, that would take them to the big time, that they approached the SANFL in the mid-80s to try and get a spot in their league. How bizarre would that have been? But new developments were about to arise. Sydney Swans owner Dr. Jeffrey Edelson was about to become a lot less of those things. Firstly, selling his controlling interest of the Sydney Swans Corporation and entity as a whole to the VFL for a tenner, and yes, that is true. And secondly, losing his medical licence and then his far, far too young wife. Don't worry though, he'll get another one. Ugh. Actually, going off on a tangent for a second, George Costanza narrated the documentary of the wedding between Jeffrey Edelston and that horrendous plastic succubus. But anyway, I'm getting off track. He's just a very, very interesting man. Makes Jeff Kennett look like me. Anyway, the AFL were tendering out the ownership of the Sydney Swans after Edelston's sale, and for a moment it looked like a group of 14 ACT AFL affiliated gents were the hot favourites to land the ownership of the Sydney Swans. If they got it, they would move the Swans to Canberra. But, unfortunately for the ACT, it didn't happen. Those new owners, by the way, well, they lost a ton of cash and ended up surrendering the licence back to the AFL within 6 years. And during that time, ironically, there were a lot of calls to move the struggling Swans to Canberra. And this wouldn't be the last time that a struggling Sydney squad with next to no fan base faced calls to move to Canberra. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I am in Bruce. Wait, hang on, I said that wrong. I'm in the suburb of Bruce. In fact, I'm in the Canberra Stadium. Built in 1977 for a few big athletics meets, this stadium was big enough to host VFL games. Only the athletics track, which was removed in the late 80s, stood in the way of it. Once it was removed and during all the Canberra Swans brouhaha, the first VFL game was played here. 1990. Hawthorn versus Sydney. Pre-season match, no stakes, and an almost guaranteed demolition for the home side at the hands of the mighty Hawks. But the match sold out, with 11,500 Canberraites flocking to see the Swans get flogged. This was more than the average attendance for the Raiders the year before, but there were two other factors. Firstly, the Raiders were playing out of Queanbeyan and were scheduled to move here for 1990. Secondly, even though they averaged sub 10,000 in 1989, the Raiders' last game of that season attracted 50,000 people, because it was the grand final, which they won. The ACT AFL had just lost the battle for local hearts. But there was no time to cry over spilt Canberra milk, no. The Canberra Raiders still technically weren't playing in a national league, it was still the New South Wales Rugby League Association. If the ACT AFL could get attention in a national competition, maybe, just maybe, Australian rules football could become the primary sport of the ACT. The battle had been lost, but the war, well, it wasn't over yet. The VFL, now the AFL, didn't seem to care. They cancelled the 1992 pre-season fixture at Canberra Stadium, at the time called Bruce Stadium, which is an awesome name. I don't know why they didn't keep that, because of falling attendances. Keep in mind, for matches between teams no one in Canberra cared about, they were still getting between 5,000 and 11,000 people pretty regularly. The game scheduled for that date was played at the 80,000 capacity Waverley Park. They got 7,000 people there. In 1993, right around the time the Raiders were winning their third premiership, the ACT launched another AFL bid with the government's help. This seemed to pique the interest of Fitzroy, who were in a financial state just above completely screwed. They sold their 1995 home fixture against the West Coast Eagles, one of the teams invented so that teams like Fitzroy could pay off those massive debts to the ACT, and so the first AFL game for premiership points was played in Bruce. At Bruce, around Bruce, however that's worded properly. Now, by this point, the Raiders had hit their final form. The reigning Premier Raiders got about 15,000 people to each game. The embattled Lions, playing a team on the other side of the biggest island on Earth, got about 11,000 people. Not as much, but pretty damn respectable. It proved exactly how much Canberraites wanted to see good footy. Well, I mean, it was Fitzroy playing, so it's not exactly good footy, but footy nonetheless. It really was amazing that they got that many people to watch their final desperate twitches before they entered their completely screwed phase and got put down the next year. The year after that, Bruce Stadium was converted into a full-time rectangular stadium in preparation for the Olympics, and so it had hosted its first and final AFL game. R.I.P. Bruce Stadium, we hardly knew ye. They still had Canberra Oval at the time. In fact, they'd had it since the very beginning. This ground hosted the initial skirmishes of the ACT AFL, otherwise known as the Cantville, otherwise known as the Ptafel. And That was terrible. After some investments to get facilities up to par, check the wicked new grandstand behind me for an example, and after the AFL took over operations of the AFL-ACT, the AFL decided to get North Melbourne to come here to play on a semi-regular basis. Not only were North Melbourne poetically a fitting choice to play at Manuka Oval, seeing as they played the ACT in the night series in the 1970s, but they were also quite a good team at the time. They built up a Death Star on an X-Wing budget and had somehow become the best team of the 1990s, excluding West Coast, probably excluding Geelong, actually not excluding Adelaide. We were lucky to win those premierships. But that X-Wing budget had come at a cost, a real cost. North Melbourne changed their name in an attempt to scam fans into thinking that they were a truly national brand instead of just some random suburb in Melbourne. It would be like, I don't know, Footscray trying to convince fans west of the Victorian border that they were the team for them by trying to convince them that they were the most western side to them, even though basically they were in a straight line with Essendon and only 5 kilometres west of North Melbourne. It was a cynical branding exercise, a cash grab, nothing more, and the Canberrans didn't really fall for it. Cynical branding exercises aside, 11,000 people came to watch the No, I'm not calling them that. They came to watch North Melbourne go up against Port Adelaide, a team who didn't have any fans outside of 3 suburbs in the smallest city at the time that wasn't Canberra, and North Melbourne promptly tore Port Adelaide to shreds. Despite the limited fan bases of both teams, it was a roaring success, and the AFL decided to make this arrangement permanent. North Melbourne from 2001 would play 2 to 3 games here at Manuka Oval, and they averaged around 11,000 people on the dot. Pretty good numbers. It ended up working well, generating huge popularity for Australian rules football in the state, and no doubt inspiring Dua Lipa simp Tom Green, St Kilda captain Jack Sinclair, and this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful man to take up AFL and eventually represent their teams at the highest level. Then, just like they did in the 1980s, the Victorians got too greedy and pissed off to Queensland. North Melbourne got an offer that, at the time, they really couldn't afford to refuse, getting millions upon millions of dollars to flee from Canberra, the city where they changed their name to try and win fans in, to move to the steaming pot that is Metricon Stadium. Partly the AFL tried to preserve relations with Canberra, doing the hard sell to Victorian clubs to try and get them to sell their home games to play in Canberra. And by gee, the Canberrans get an absolute mixed bag with the 2009 Western Bulldogs and Melbourne sides. Gee whiz. Honestly, that's like getting an Easter show bag and getting, I don't know, a brand new iPhone and then a proximity mine in the same bag. But still, the Canberrans flocked to see the footy because they'd got addicted to it, getting 10,000 or more at every single game, except one of those terrible, terrible Melbourne games. I would not want to see the 2009 Demons, even if they were playing in my own backyard, so I can't say I blame them on that one. After that though, the AFL had begun expanding. They gave the Gold Coast its shiny, brand new, stinking pile of garbage that is its football team, and Canberra said, well hey, I want some of that too. Unfortunately, they got turned down for, these guys. Yep, back here again. The ACT government signed a $2.3 million per year deal, or roughly half of Israel Folau's initial GWS contract value, to host 3 games per year for the next decade in Canberra. Sure enough, it was here, not in the actual town that the Giants called home, where they won their first game. Even so, it took them a while to really gain a foothold here. In their first 4 years, only 1 game broke the average attendance that North Melbourne had at this very ground, with that game only breaking that mark by 23. And judging by the way that the Giants played on that day, I'm guessing that those extra 23 were the Giants' playing staff. But an uptick in performance did result in an increase in attendance figures, a major increase. They got 15,000 people here to watch a Richmond game in 2016. Even now, in 2023, the Giants regularly get higher attendances here than in the very city in which they are based. Canberrans are so desperate for top-level football that they'll out-attend a team from someone else's home market, a home market that is 20 times the size. Tells you a lot, doesn't it?
So we've established that the ACT has the requisite history, desire and attendance to host an AFL team. So how can it happen? Well, option 1 would be relocation. Since Tasmania is now not an option, the only markets left for struggling clubs to move to would be, Cairns, Darwin and Canberra. And look, it may be a bit cold there and you're half a chance of running into Barnaby Joyce and having him steal your wife, but Canberra's got the best facilities of the lot. Obviously the Giants are the main candidate, but the club's built a fledgling following here in its intended home market. Talking to other Giants fans, I've noticed that it's done its job, increasing play rates for the sport west of the A3. Besides, and more pertinently, the AFL aren't going to give up and concede defeat on their pet project which has cost them hundreds of millions already. Option 2 is promotion. The Ainsley Tricolours, for example, are the most successful team in the ACT League. Funny, considering that they wear this. Sorry, Saints fans. That was low-hanging fruit. 28 local league flags, off-field facilities worthy of being part of most of the ACT's actual AFL bids in the past, and proximity to the AIS could see them in a good position to be the ACT's representative.
Alternatively, Eastlake, who have been around since 1926, are based at Manuka Oval, which, as we've already established, has a deep connection with football in the Australian Capital Territory. It would be a fitting name and a fitting place with which to play football at the highest level, and a team that is truly representative of the Australian Capital Territory.
But I don't think it's going to happen that way. Look, there hasn't been a team promoted from a different league to the VFL-AFL since 1925, and no, Port Adelaide does not count. The chances of this happening are very, very, very astronomically low. It won't happen like that.
Option 3? Clean slate, just like GWS, just like the Gold Coast, and just like Tasmania. But, unlike Tasmania, we already have a shiny, brand new facility here that's already proved that it's worthy of AFL action. So, Canberra could well be the 20th team in the AFL. But should it be?
Yes, Canberra deserves a team to call their own. You know who else does? The Northern Territory. The NT has the highest footy participation rate, with a third of its players being female. They've produced far more and far better talent than the ACT and have been largely ignored by the AFL for, ever. A club can always relocate to Canberra, looking at you, North Melbourne. To set up in Alice Springs or Darwin, you'd need and want a clean slate for both cultural and administrative reasons. Footy in the NT is itself a topic for another video, and let me know if you'd like me to tell their tale, but if this league is going to be capped at 20 teams, which it probably should be, Canberra is not the place I'd give that final fresh licence to. So unfortunately, it looks like the ACT is in for another long winter of feasting off the scraps of others, until someone sees fit to give it the fresh, gourmet meal its people deserve.